experiencing a complete collapse following a federal judge's issuance of an emergency order that freezes nearly every asset belonging to the Trump Organization. This came after explosive discoveries of widespread fraud and Trump's inability to provide the enormous bond needed to postpone a historic civil ruling that threatens to permanently destroy the business dynasty that has been central to his entire identity. This goes beyond just another ordinary legal problem. A court is essentially stepping in and taking charge of the whole Trump Organization, including its real estate properties, business bank accounts, and even Donald Trump's personal access to finances. We're looking at Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, his hotel properties, his golf club properties, everything that has ever represented Donald Trump as a business figure. All of it frozen, all of it beyond reach. Trump has no ability to sell anything. He has no ability to transfer ownership. He has no ability to conceal assets. He doesn't even have the ability to use his own properties to get loans. His empire has been secured like it's an active crime scene. And the explanation for why this freeze was implemented so forcefully is straightforward. Trump didn't provide the hundreds of millions of dollars in bond that were required to postpone the enforcement of the fraud ruling against him. A ruling that determined the Trump Organization deliberately inflated the values of properties, sometimes by ridiculous, impossible quantities, in order to get better loans and insurance arrangements year after year. Prosecutors characterized it as an intentional pattern of dishonesty that wasn't just occurring in the edges of the business, it was occurring at the highest level. Now, before going further, if you're keeping up with this unfolding story with us and you value transparent, fact-based analyses of what's taking place within America's legal and political environment, be sure to subscribe to the channel. It genuinely does support us in continuing this coverage, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We're always grateful to hear from viewers throughout the country and across the globe. Back to the emergency situation. The asset freeze isn't just symbolic. It's not limited. It's not restricted. It's complete. The judge's directive extends into every part of the Trump Organization's empire. From signature towers in Manhattan to extensive golf properties in Florida and Scotland, nothing can be moved without the permission of the court and monitors who have now been granted power to examine every financial move Trump tries to make. For someone who has constructed his whole image around the concept of dominance, authority, and financial expertise, this represents the absolute worst scenario possible. Waking up one morning to find that your name remains on the structures, but the authority to manage them no longer exists for you. And here's what makes this situation even more disastrous. With every asset frozen, Trump has no access to equity. He has no ability to borrow using properties. He can't move assets around, not even within his own companies, to generate the cash he requires to cover his increasing legal expenses or maintain his political activities. Trump's whole business approach for many decades has centered on flexibility, shifting assets between different entities, refinancing real estate, using debt strategically. That complete strategy has now been eliminated by one court directive. Financial professionals are describing this as the same as pulling the emergency stop on a train traveling at maximum velocity. In the meantime, Wall Street is in a state of alarm. Banks that have outstanding loans to Trump are examining their risk exposure. Insurance partners are thinking about whether they even want to remain connected with the organization. Major accounting firms are quietly advising clients that business dealings with Trump entities might become unstable. Vendors are anxious about whether they'll receive payment. Workers throughout Trump properties, from hotel management staff to golf course employees, are preparing for the likelihood of job cuts, operational shutdowns, or ownership transitions. This has stopped being just Trump's issue anymore. The repercussions are spreading outward through multiple industries that have financial connections to him. The mental strain on Trump is also probably enormous. Court-appointed receivers might soon take over and operate the Trump Organization like it's a struggling company in trouble. They would determine which assets remain, which assets are removed, and if required, what properties must be sold to satisfy the judgment. Picture the Trump brand, which has been promoted for decades as representing wealth and achievement, being removed from buildings by court officials because the organization is no longer legally able to keep them. That image by itself would represent a crushing hit to Trump's political reputation, a reputation he relies on for survival in an election period where strength and achievement are his main selling features, and the political ramifications are huge. Trump's campaign approach has consistently depended on displaying wealth, power, and self-sufficiency. But what occurs when you abruptly cannot pay your legal representation, what occurs when you cannot personally finance campaign activities, cannot fund rallies at the magnitude you previously did, cannot purchase advertisements in swing states because your accounts are frozen, and every dollar you use is under examination. Contributors who previously saw Trump as a powerful, financially unbreakable leader are now quietly wondering whether they're backing a candidate whose empire is falling apart from within. And political adversaries are already developing attack advertisements portraying Trump not as a successful business figure, but as someone whose empire was constructed on fraud and is now being taken apart by the courts one piece at a time. This represents just the start. The magnitude of what's happening is nearly impossible to overstate. Trump is confronting not simply a financial emergency, but an existential one: legal, political, personal, and historical. And the courts are just beginning. The freeze encompasses everything, and the range of it is so overwhelming that even experienced legal experts are stating they've never witnessed anything comparable for someone of Trump's position. We're not discussing one challenged property or a limited injunction. We're discussing the legal equivalent of placing an entire corporation inside a transparent container and informing the owner he can observe but he cannot interact. Trump's attorneys are apparently in emergency mode, working frantically to persuade the courts that the freeze is excessively expansive, excessively restrictive, excessively damaging for regular business activities to proceed. But the judge's directive makes evident that this wasn't executed casually. It was executed because the court had reason to believe that without such an extensive freeze, Trump might try exactly what he's been charged with doing for decades: relocating assets to protect them from responsibility. And that's what distinguishes this moment from earlier Trump legal conflicts. Previously, Trump has consistently had space to operate. When lawsuits arrived, he filed countersuits. When debts became due, he refinanced. When properties didn't perform well, he reorganized ownership or transferred money through various entities until the difficulties subsided. But those approaches are eliminated now. The court has essentially blocked every exit Trump has used throughout his business life. He cannot conduct shell operations. He cannot depend on the adaptability of his corporate organization. He cannot transfer money discreetly through trusts or limited liability companies. The financial labyrinth he spent 4 decades constructing as protection has now been converted into a confinement he cannot escape. Meanwhile, legal commentators are cautioning that this is only the first phase of a significantly larger breakdown if Trump cannot meet the judgment. If he doesn't make payment, and all indications point to he cannot, then the courts possess the power to start taking properties directly, not simply freezing, taking that indicates compulsory sales. That indicates auctions. That indicates Trump Tower, the primary symbol of Trump's identity, might be listed on the market, not because Trump chooses to sell it, but because the government is selling it to cover his debt. The embarrassment of that alone would be extraordinary for a former president. The sight of Trump's name being removed from buildings by court directive would be a moment carved into political history. And the contradiction is harsh. Trump has spent years informing the world he's worth billions, yet he couldn't assemble the bond needed to postpone the judgment. That inability communicates a vastly different narrative about his real financial condition, one that lenders and risk evaluators already comprehend. Bond companies examined Trump's finances and responded, no, banks that previously lent to him have withdrawn. Financial organizations now regard him as a dangerous client, excessively risky, excessively unstable, excessively unpredictable. When the individuals who evaluate wealth professionally determine you aren't worth the risk, that's not politics, that's mathematics. But the legal conflict isn't simply about the money, it's about the fraud discoveries that initiated all of this. Those discoveries didn't originate from political statements or media interpretation. They originated from documents, accountants, financial condition statements, internal correspondence, the fundamental materials of business activities. And what those materials exposed was a deliberate pattern of exaggerating property values to deceive banks and insurance companies, not by a small percentage, not by arguable margins, but by hundreds of millions of dollars simultaneously, inflating a penthouse from 11,000 square feet to 30,000, asserting a property was worth 5 times what similar sales indicated, generating valuations that no reasonable lender would accept unless they had personal trust in Trump. And many had that trust. Now, those lenders are understanding the degree to which they were deceived. And in confidential discussions, many of them are infuriated, not only because they may have made choices based on incorrect information, but because being connected with this controversy now involves reputational danger. No bank wants to clarify to regulators why it kept conducting business with someone whose company has been legally determined fraudulent at its foundation. And while all of this develops, Trump's political operation is managing an emergency of its own. Campaign personnel are publicly concerned about financial resources. A presidential campaign requires hundreds of millions of dollars, and Trump's legal conflicts now absorb an astonishing amount of his fundraising. With his assets frozen, he cannot add personal money even if he chose to, and contributors, particularly wealthy ones, are reconsidering. They don't want their donations used to maintain a failing empire operational. They don't want to support a candidate who might spend the coming year managing court appearances, asset confiscations, and political gatherings like spinning plates on poles. They want a victor. Stability, consistency, and Trump at this moment seems anything except stable. And still, the consequences extend further. Trump's complete political image is constructed on the concept that he's a successful billionaire who understands how to manage things. But how do you manage a country when courts are managing your businesses? How do you campaign on being an expert negotiator when you couldn't negotiate a bond? How do you assert you constructed a magnificent empire when judges are now taking it apart? That's the battle Trump is confronting. Not simply in courtrooms, but in public perception. As the emergency intensifies, the most notable transformation isn't occurring in the legal setting, but inside Trump's own circle, where supporters who previously displayed complete confidence are abruptly careful, restrained, even noticeably shaken. Some of Trump's long-term business partners are creating distance, providing courteous but unclear statements about observing the circumstances or waiting for additional information, which is political and corporate language for this is more serious than we anticipated and we don't want to be drawn into it. Previous executives who previously commended Trump's financial brilliance are quietly recognizing that the fraud discoveries are impossible to reject as partisan criticism because they're established in documentation. His own company created, and it's not simply the insiders, financial evaluators, real estate professionals, and corporate lawyers throughout the country are describing this judgment as a model for how regulators and state legal officers can dismantle influential business systems that participate in fraud, even if those systems are managed by someone as politically protected as a former president. This is unexplored ground, an example case that might echo for decades. If Trump can lose authority of his empire because of dishonest valuations, what does that indicate for other real estate empires that function in the uncertain areas of valuation methods? Many individuals in the business community are suddenly anxious because if courts begin implementing this degree of examination broadly, the complete luxury real estate industry might encounter substantial legal danger. But while the financial industry evaluates the spreading consequences, Trump's legal representation is engaged in a frantic effort. They're submitting emergency motions, appealing to superior courts, contending that the freeze is excessive, punishing, and harmful beyond what's needed. They're attempting to persuade judges that Trump requires access to, at minimum, some cash to keep operations running and satisfy his responsibilities. But the issue is straightforward. The court has no trust in him, not following the fraud discoveries, not following years of unclear financial operations, and not when there's obvious evidence the Trump organization has an extensive record of relocating assets, changing entity names, and reorganizing ownership in methods that create difficulty for creditors to pursue payment. The court's stance is essentially this. If Trump desires flexibility, he'll need to demonstrate it by complying, not by demanding trust he hasn't shown. And existing behind all of this is the frightening likelihood, at minimum for Trump, that receivers might assume direct authority of his properties. These aren't just ceremonial roles. A court-appointed receiver possesses genuine power. They can assume management. They can authorize or reject spending. They can reorganize operations. They can sell assets when needed. In serious situations, they can even dissolve entities. If Trump Tower ends up under receivership, Donald Trump might enter a building displaying his name only to be informed he has no power to make operational choices. The symbolism of that is nearly like Shakespeare. The individual who constructed an image on control, power, and deal-making reduced to an observer in his own empire. Politically, adversaries are getting ready for precisely that story. They're positioned to contend that Trump cannot guide the nation when he cannot legally guide his own businesses. They're prepared to state that someone whose empire is breaking down under fraud discoveries cannot be relied upon with the federal budget, national security, or the challenges of international leadership. They're getting ready to present him not as a powerful businessman, but as someone who marketed a false impression of achievement for decades and is now being revealed in the most severe way imaginable. And yet, Trump's supporters will probably see all of this as just another assault, another illustration of the system attempting to destroy him. But even dedication has boundaries. When the fundamental circumstances begin to change, when gatherings decrease because financing disappears, when advertisements vanish because money isn't available, when legal defeats become regular news and criminal proceedings compete for attention with campaign activities, supporters might remain emotionally committed, but financially, that's a completely different matter. And then there's the campaign issue. How do you pursue the presidency when your focus is split between political warfare, legal planning, and financial crisis management? Trump has consistently succeeded on disorder, but this isn't the type of disorder he manages. This is disorder forced upon him. Courtrooms, judges, prosecutors, creditors, financial supervisors. It's an environment where Trump cannot control the speed or the story, an environment where he's responding rather than controlling. And history demonstrates that when Trump loses the capacity to manage the narrative, his political power decreases. The importance is tremendous, not simply for Trump, but for the country. Because if this emergency grows, and every indication proposes it will, we may soon be observing something no American has ever witnessed. A former president, an active presidential candidate observing his complete financial empire be either frozen, taken apart, or sold under court oversight while he campaigns for the most powerful position on earth. It's without precedent. It's destabilizing, and the result is distant from obvious. As this financial catastrophe expands, another aspect of the emergency is beginning to develop. The psychological breakdown that arrives when someone who constructed his identity on wealth, power, and control abruptly confronts the genuine possibility of losing all three simultaneously. Individuals close to Trump state the atmosphere around him has changed significantly. He's moving between resistance and alarm, between guaranteeing complete success on appeal and privately questioning how this could have occurred. For decades, Trump functioned in an environment where lawsuits were simply another type of bargaining, where financial difficulties were temporary problems that could be managed with forceful lawyers and inventive accounting. But this occasion, none of those strategies are functioning. And for the first occasion, the results aren't restricted to one property or one transaction. They're consuming everything. The mental effect of that cannot be emphasized enough. Trump has consistently portrayed himself as unreachable, as someone who could manipulate systems to his benefit, as a businessman who consistently discovers an exit. Yet now, judges are releasing directives he cannot balance. Financial organizations are declining to support him, and prosecutors are presenting fraud discoveries so comprehensive that even his most dedicated defenders have difficulty dismissing them. It's an emergency that attacks the center of his legend, not simply his finances, but his identity. Meanwhile, the political environment is getting ready for the following phase of consequences. Campaign planners from both parties are handling this like a political catastrophe whose after effects will disturb the complete upcoming election cycles. Democrats perceive and chance to characterize Trump permanently, not simply as controversial or divisive, but as essentially dishonest, someone whose complete business standing was constructed on deception and dishonesty. Republicans, alternatively, are frightened of being pulled into the breakdown Some worry that being excessively closely connected to Trump might put their own campaigns at danger, particularly in competitive areas where voters desire stability and trustworthiness, not a candidate connected with a failing empire and a legal disaster. Behind private doors, Republican officials are raising questions that would have been unimaginable even 12 months ago. Can Trump actually reach Election Day financially undamaged? Can he legally hold office if his assets stay under court management? And perhaps most significantly, will the party be required to intervene if the financial and legal circumstances spiral to a level where Trump becomes excessively compromised to proceed? These are the discussions occurring quietly, carefully, away from public observation, but they're occurring. And then there's the wider question. What occurs to the Republican identity if Trump's business empire is taken apart in real time during a campaign? The Republican Party has invested years connecting itself with Trump's image as a successful businessman who represented strength and wealth. If that representation breaks down entirely, the political expense might be substantial. The party might encounter an identity emergency required to separate itself from the exact person who transformed it. Simultaneously, financial regulators and legal academics are examining this moment as a potential critical point in how courts manage business fraud, particularly involving people who control prominent enterprises with complicated networks of subsidiary companies. The communication being transmitted is clear. No quantity of recognition, influence, or political power excludes someone from legal responsibility. And if Trump's empire can be frozen, supervised, and required into potential sale, then no business leader is beyond access. But the most urgent result, one that might develop at any time, is the likelihood of a required sale. If Trump cannot obtain the money to meet the judgment, the court can permit receivers to begin selling portions of the empire. And if that occurs, it will be executed at market values, not Trump exaggerated valuations. Buildings will sell for what they're genuinely worth. Properties will be evaluated by independent experts. And the Trump brand will be assessed not through self-advertising, but through the harsh reality of market interest. That procedure would reveal in the most public and humiliating method possible the distinction between Trump's statements about his wealth and the genuine financial reality behind the surface. And it wouldn't simply be a loss of money. It would be the destruction of an image that Trump invested his complete adult existence creating. The Golden Towers, the extravagant estates, the representation of achievement, all of it connected to his political identity. All of it now susceptible to confiscation. As this emergency accelerates, one thing is becoming obvious. Donald Trump is no longer battling simply to maintain his wealth. He's battling to maintain the representation of himself that he has invested decades marketing to the American public. Because if the courts remove that, if they remove the towers, the golf courses, the hotels, the brand, what stays is a question Trump has never permitted anyone to raise without the empire, without the false impression of unequaled achievement. Who is he? And can he survive politically without the legend that created him? The following phase of this emergency will respond to that question. And the importance for Trump, for the political environment, and for the country could not be more significant. And that leads us to the most disturbing reality in all of this. We are observing a former president's financial empire breakdown in real time, not because of politics, not because of bias, but because of the courts, the evidence, and the rule of law. This is not interpretation. This is not campaign communication. This is the judicial system presenting piece by piece what it determines actually occurred inside the Trump organization for decades. And as these results develop, Trump is discovering himself restricted from every direction. His assets are frozen, his lenders are absent, his legal expenses are increasing dramatically. His campaign is fighting for survival. And now, for the first occasion in his public existence, the thing he has consistently depended on, money, reputation, the legend of invincibility is escaping from his control faster than he can secure it. But the genuine question, the one this country will need to address, is what occurs when someone whose business is breaking down, whose finances are under judicial management, whose legal responsibilities are increasing by the day, still desires to be President of the United States? What occurs when the demands of private breakdown collide with the authorities of public position? What occurs when a political campaign becomes essentially a defense against financial destruction? Because that is where we are currently. Not guesswork, not hypothesis, reality. A former president pursuing office while judges manage his assets, creditors surround like predators. And prosecutors advance cases that might redefine the boundaries of presidential responsibility. And whether you back Trump or challenge him, whether you think he's being unjustly pursued or simply experiencing long delayed results, the reality stays. These following months will establish not only the destiny of one individual, but the power of the legal system itself. Will the courts remain firm? Will the rule of law persist? Or will political influence overcome everything? We don't understand yet. But what we do understand is that this moment, right now, is unlike anything in contemporary American history. A business empire on the edge, a presidential campaign under pressure, a legal conflict that might transform the presidency for generations. And as this story keeps developing, one thing is definite. What arrives next will transform everything.